Rav Kook says we need nevuah to come back. We need the return of prophecy. He identifies, if you want, halacha as detail-oriented Judaism and nevuah as big picture Judaism, value Judaism. He says we need the big values to come back, which is why Rav Kook was really into the idea of learning not just the halachic sections of the Talmud, but also the Aggadic sections, not just learning the Talmud, but also learning Tanach, philosophy. And he felt that this would enable us to create a balanced Judaism where we would start being able to connect the small details into the big picture, into the big values.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. For over 2 millennia, the Jewish people has lived in a world largely defined by Jewish law, or halacha. While the Tanach is filled with what might be called Prophetic Judaism, a Judaism, that is, which is dominated by those who spoke in the name of God, the Judaism that emerged during the era of the Second Temple and thereafter placed a greater emphasis on the minutiae of halachic practice and the intense study of Torah. This halachic Judaism has been a massive success and has kept the Jewish people alive for the duration of hour-long exile. For that entire time, Jews have successfully come into contact with the presence of God through their observance of Jewish law. The question, though, is whether in 2024 we need to add more of the prophetic element alongside our continued commitment to halacha. Perhaps today we need a new infusion of prophecy, both in terms of its spiritual content as well as through a renewed emphasis on Torah values that may sometimes be lost in standard halachic discourse. Rav Kook entertained this possibility 100 years ago, and in today's episode, Rabbi Alex Israel and I discussed the potential for a new kind of prophetic Judaism. We talked about the sad reality that some people feel that halacha alone does not satisfy their spiritual thirst. We also highlighted the risk of losing the forest of Torah values for the trees of the myriad details of Jewish law. We acknowledged that there are some who are simply turned off by Jewish law's extreme attention to detail, as well as by the need to rely upon authority in order to fulfill it successfully. Ultimately, the puzzle is how we can maintain and further halacha while simultaneously enriching Judaism with greater spirituality and a heightened sense of morality, ethics, and kindness, all of which ideally should emerge from within Jewish law. How shall we combine the necessity of including a living prophetic agenda within our commitment to fulfilling the details of halachic practice? We'll begin that conversation in just a moment. First, let me remind you to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Last week I released an article entitled The Bombing of February 15th, which discussed the dual truths that tragic mistakes, like the killing of 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen in Gaza last week, are a terrible yet inevitable consequence of urban warfare, and the fact that Israel, like any country engaged in fighting, must do everything in its power to make sure that episodes like this never happen again. The link is in the description of this podcast, so get your free subscription today, and please make sure to share it with your friends as well. And finally, remember that JCH Podcast Productions is the best place for you to go in order to produce your podcast from start to finish. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com so that we can discuss helping you make a high-quality, professional, and popular podcast. Rabbi Alex Israel, an author and international speaker, teaches at Midrashet Lindenbaum and at Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi. He records a popular daily podcast called the Tanach Podcast, which you can find on Spotify. You can also find his writings at alexisrael.org. Rabbi Alex Israel, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Scott. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Let's begin with a well-known quote from Masechet Baba Batra 12a, page Yud Bet Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Abdimi Demin Haifa. Rabbi Abdimi from Haifa said, Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash, from the day the temple was destroyed, Nidla Nevuah min HaNevi'im, prophecy was removed from the prophets, V'nidna l'chachamim, and given to the sages. Atu chacham lav navihu? Is this to say that a wise person, a sage, isn't also a prophet? Hachi kamar, this is what he was saying. Af al pi shenitla min hanevi'im, min hachachamim lo nitla. Even though prophecy was taken away from the prophets, it was not taken away from the sages. Amar a Maimar, and a Maimar commented on this, V'chacham adif minavi. A sage is preferable to a prophet. There's a lot to discuss here, but I thought that would be a good way of opening up because it highlights one of Chazal's great innovations, the idea of replacing the prophetic, essentially, with the intellectual. Perhaps some people wouldn't call that an innovation, but I think it's a fair way of putting it. This idea, this emphasis on the intellectual study of Torah in place of a prophetic direct line to God has kept Judaism alive and thriving for 2,000 years. And some would argue that there are some problems with it because even though it has worked tremendously well, no one's doubting that, sometimes it may downplay the spiritual, downplay the prophetic, instead of giving us that special connection to the divine that many of us crave. As an opening, Alex, what would you think about that idea? Is there a problem in the halachic system that needs to be addressed because we no longer have the prophetic?
So I'll try and say this. I think a lot of people crave a direct line. People want to know that what they're doing is the right way. People want to know that what they're doing is connected to God. And I hear this in many, many different ways as almost a critique of Orthodox Judaism or halachic Judaism sometimes. And I can hear it in one of two ways. Either some people might turn around and say, well, I do a lot of actions, but I don't feel the spirit. I go to shul, but I don't feel a direct connection. If only there was a prophet, if only I could feel God speaking to me and I'm not just speaking to God. And I think that's one type of critique that sometimes we can hear, that halachic Judaism is very, very action-based and it lacks spirituality. I think one of the attractions in today's world to Chassidut is that Chassidut makes God very present in our lives, even in humdrum activities. And I think people are really looking for a connection to the divine. They don't always find it in the intellectual. They don't always find it in practice Judaism. And so therefore, I do think that people would like to have a situation in which they can really experience prophecy. Let me add one thing. Sometimes people also feel a distance from halacha because they feel it is a human construction. I find something ironic. A lot of times when people teach halacha, they like teaching the chain of halacha, going through from the pasuk to the Talmudic passage, through the Rishonim, to the modern commentators. And a lot of times, halachic teachers of halacha think that this is going to endear halacha to the listener, to the student, and then they'll understand that they've gone through the entire chain. The funny thing is, I've also heard from some people, they said, well, I went to all those classes and now I realize that this is a human process. And you know what? I think differently. I'm a modern person and I don't agree with that necessarily, their attitude towards women. I don't necessarily agree to their conception of community. And therefore, the halacha which they've come up with doesn't necessarily connect to me. So we're in an interesting place when we put the rabbinic tradition rather than a direct line from God, because it makes things complicated.
It does indeed. And I have to say that I myself, as you're talking about that attraction to Chassidut, I have mixed emotions about it, I guess I should say, because on the one hand, I grew up in a Rav Soloveitchik type of environment. I went to Maimonides School, which he founded in Boston. I read a lot of his works. And that idea of a tekes, a ceremony that's not based on the halachic tradition, just because it makes you feel close to God, in some level, I feel that's empty. That's not Jewish. That's just doing whatever you want. And on the other hand, I fully understand the problem with people who feel that they're alienated from halacha. And I don't really know how to bridge these two different attitudes because, thank God, I'm comfortable with living a halachic life, but I understand it's not quite so simple for other people for very good reasons.
If you mention Rav Soloveitchik, even though for many people Rav Soloveitchik is, the paragon of the sort of yeshiva personality, Rav Soloveitchik was really a soul on fire in so many ways. And there's a beautiful, beautiful passage in The Lonely Man of Faith where he talks about this transition between prophecy and the Second Temple, where we say that, there weren't certain miracles in the temple. The Aron and the Kruvim, the Ark and the cherubs weren't there. There wasn't prophecy. And Rav Soloveitchik relates to the fact that during this time, in the Second Temple period is exactly when prayer was crystallized and was formulated. And he says something to the effect of, if God has stopped calling us, we're still going to keep on calling him. We need to have this very, very vibrant, living, experiential connection to Hashem. So I think it's really important when we talk about Rav Soloveitchik, the person, but also the tradition that he represents, that for Rav Soloveitchik, it was an aboriginal, powerful experience of being connected to God. And he really felt the need of a direct line, a direct link.
And I think, if I recall that passage in Rav Soloveitchik in The Lonely Man of Faith, he said something along the lines as well of saying the difference between prophecy and prayer is only a matter of direction. Prophecy is God speaking, and the prophet must listen. Prayer is man speaking, and God promises to listen. It's really the same process. It's the same phenomenon. The only question is who's doing the speaking.
Right.
Let's talk about why prophecy stopped in the first place. Obviously, Chazal have a certain approach towards that. Maybe understanding better why there is no prophecy, as best as we can understand it, can give us a better sense of what we should do nowadays, given that that has continued to be the case.
Right. So it's a really interesting question, why prophecy ended. For some, there is one school which sees it sort of like coming from God's direction. If you want, the batteries sort of ran out. There was a Shechina in Bayit Rishon, there was no Shechina in Bayit Sheni. There were certain miracles. It's interesting to think about Bayit Sheni without the Aron. Such a central embodiment of the connection between human beings and God was in the first temple, and now there's no Ark of the Covenant in the second temple, and that there were all sorts of miracles that were elusive, which weren't there in the second temple. So you sort of like then see it as like we began all the way up there at the top of the ladder, and we went down a few rungs, and we weren't able to achieve that spiritual level. By the way, having said that, the Gemara continues that you read before and says, we don't have prophecy, but we have a but call, right? I actually love that phrase, but call, right? It's like the daughter of a voice. What is that? Like an echo? What is that? And then when we finish with a but call, sometimes we'll say this Hasidic Rebbe, he really has, now people talk about Das Torah in Misnagdisha circles, and I don't know exactly what they say with, you have Aliyat Neshama within the world of Hasidut. In other words, it's really interesting that people over time have insisted that there's no prophecy, but they give it other names.
There's something.
But having said that, so some people will say just simply the supply sort of became weak. But other people will claim that Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni, first temple and second temple, had a really, really different dynamic to them. Maybe I can relate to a famous Talmudic passage. People talk about that. At Mount Sinai, we said Na'aseh v'nishma. Hashem came to the Jewish people in a state of revelation, and we responded by saying Na'aseh v'nishma. But of course, there's something flawed about that, because we were sort of wowed, and according to the Gemara, kafa alehem har k'gigit, we were under some sense of duress, maybe by the fact that we'd been slaves and we'd just been freed, or because we were scared. And then they say kimu v'kiblu, that in the time of Purim, and Purim takes place at the inception of the Second Temple period, that the Jewish people re-accepted the Torah. Now, on a simple level, I've always understood kimu v'kiblu, and the Gemara wants to say that means that the Jewish people re-accepted Judaism of their own volition. So at a simple level, I would say it's like this, if you're still willing to be Jewish, after you've been exiled from your land, experienced, exile and the destruction of your temple and the dissolution of your nation state, and you've gone into exile, and you even in exile, you experience Purim, right? You experience attempted genocide, and still then you want to be Jewish, then you're pretty committed. Everything's stacked against you, you're really in. So I think at that level, kimu v'kiblu means that the Jewish people, are really, really powerfully engaged. But look at the difference. At Mount Sinai, it is a top-down experience. At Mount Sinai, it is God coming to talk to the Jewish people, and we have to say Na'aseh v'nishma. Kimu v'kiblu is the initiative of the Jewish people. There's something grassroots about it. There's something coming from below. And I think that goes along with that sense that prophecy is from the top down. It's a message from God to human beings. And Talmud Torah, the world of the rabbis, happens in the Bet Midrash. It's the opposite of prophecy, right? What we call lo bashamayim hi, right? The idea that Torah is not in the heavens. If a prophet came into the Bet Midrash and said, God says X, we'd say, come and sit down, come discuss the Gemara, let's learn the Shulchan Aruch together. There is something which is going through the funnel of the human experience. And here, what we're actually experiencing is a sea change, a change in direction. It isn't just that the supply runs out and therefore prophecy is waning and it's weak. According to this, Chacham Adif Min Avi is almost like what something didn't work in the first temple period. Prophecy had run its course, and it ran its course, and it shattered. It shattered with the destruction of the first temple. The first destruction of the first temple means something's not working. And it's almost as if, along with Beit Sheni, along with the second temple starts, created a whole new dynamic, which is sort of bottom up. It is more grassroots. And the Bet Midrash is the key institution. And this is a whole different world.
Then let me ask you, Alex, I'll say something which is somewhat sacrilegious, but I've been thinking about lately, and I'm curious how you would relate to this based on what you just said. The difference between prophecy being top-down and Kimu v'Kiblu, the Beit Midrash, being bottom-up. But it isn't fully bottom-up, because we still rely on that Chacham Adif Min Avi. We no longer are relying on a prophet. We still, however, are relying on experts in halacha. And I think some people are turned off by that. I think some people don't like the idea that it is very non-democratic in the sense that, yes, if you study for a very, very long time, perhaps you can determine the halacha on your own. But if you don't, you are at the mercy, so to speak, of scholars. Obviously, on some level, that only makes sense. I'm not going to decide on my own a medical procedure. I'm going to go to a doctor. If I have a legal question, I'm going to go to a lawyer. If I have a halachic question, I should go to a halachic scholar. But, and here's my question, in some places, the level required of those halachic scholars to be considered a true scholar is so extreme. I don't mean extreme in a bad way, but we're talking about someone who's learned for 40, 50, 60 years, essentially preparing to be that halachic scholar, that people feel disenfranchised. I'll give you an example. Someone wrote to me in a comment about halacha and the halachic process. He said, being a halachic scholar, it's not like brain surgery. That's easy. Being a halachic scholar requires real work and real study. And that sort of stuck with me in a negative sense, in the sense that we say, lo b'shamayim, no, it's not in heaven. It is on earth, as you mentioned before. But when it's only deposited, according to most people, or at least some people, with the very, very, very top scholars, and I'm not given a voice in any real way, that also takes away my ability to have a share in it, so to speak. How would you respond to that? Because if I really wanted to push it, I could say that there's 3 stages. There's Na'aseh v'Nishma, which was the first Luchot, and that was Hashem talking directly to the people. Then there was Moshe Rabbeinu in the second Luchot on Yom Kippur, where there's no more Na'aseh v'Nishma, but it's still top down, but it's a scholar talking to the people. And then there's Kimu v'Kiblu, which is grassroots. We don't hear of any leader who said that. It was the people, and that's what it was. Of course, that then became the system of Chazal and the system of scholarship. But is there any idea of maybe democratizing halacha?
That's a good question. The question, I think this is a question in general of expertise. I once had an experience with my son. My son had a little bit of asthma as a child, and we used to go to a lung specialist. And at some point, we went to one, and then whatever reason, he couldn't receive us anymore, so we went to a different specialist. And the first time we met him, he looked at all the tests, and he asked my son, he said, well, if you run, do you experience any strain in breathing? And he said, no. He says, well, if you do this, do you ever have to? And he said, no. He says to my son, who at the time is 9 years old, he says to him, so do you think you still need the inhaler? My son looked at him strangely and said, that's what we came to ask you. And I find it interesting that there was once a time where your bank manager would call you in and say, this is the investment you need to do. Now, generally, your bank manager or insurance broker will say, well, this is the risky investment where you can earn more and risk more. This is the safe investment where you'll earn less and risk less. And what do you want to do? Even in terms of medicine, right? A doctor will turn around to you and say, look, you can go for this surgery. Here are the dangers, right? And to that degree, we live in a world which is giving far more agency to the client, to the person. I think people would like that in the halachic world. I do think that to a certain degree, not that I love people puzzling by the internet certainly has given people that ability of knowledge. Because somebody will come to me, will phone me up with a she'ilah. I'm involved with weddings frequently for maybe communities who are either irreligious or less religious. And frequently they'll come and they say, well, I read on a website ABC. Can we do that? So I think the internet has allowed us to be in a far more democratized world. And I think that is, to a certain degree, making its mark even in halacha. Now we can ask the question, is that correct? Right? Is that correct? And obviously I wouldn't want people paskening, just like I wouldn't want people doing surgery off the internet. I wouldn't want, or prescribing, medicines from the internet. I wouldn't want halacha. You need somebody who's proficient. But again, I will say that we all know that throughout halacha, there is an interaction between the person and the halacha itself. We can see that through various different machlokot from the Mishnah on. It's true about Hillel and Shammai, who were very, very different people. And therefore, I'll just maybe, in answer to your question, I'll say this. I remember being in high school. I was a Bnei Akiva boy, and most of my teachers were Haredi. And we used to ask them a question, can we go and see this movie during the Omer? And their answer was, well, who said you can go to a movie? It used to drive me crazy, right? You need a posek who at least values your value system and your lifestyle. Well, I'll give you maybe another example. Somebody will come to a rabbi and will say, I want to be able to hold my wife's hand during childbirth, even though during childbirth, technically the wife is considered to be in a status of nidah, and usually husband and wife don't touch when the woman is in a status of nidah. So it's very emotionally important. If a rabbi would turn around and say, she'll get through the labor anyway, your physical support doesn't matter, right? For me, at the very first level, the rabbi has to understand my human situation. Then we can talk about the halacha. Don't discount the fact that that's important to me or to my wife, and then say, well, that doesn't matter, and therefore that's not a halachic, factor. So I think that's relevant to this topic.
I definitely hear that. And I suppose if I want to clarify a little more of what I meant, I don't mean that we don't need proficiency. I don't mean that anyone should decide whatever they want to do, because that makes no sense either. I guess my question sometimes is, when proficiency is defined as someone who has learned in an advanced way for 70 years, and anything less than that, so to speak, obviously perhaps I'm being a little bit extreme here, but anything less than that is not sufficient, and therefore you have no valid opinion, people can feel, well, I really don't need this anymore, because in every other area of my life, my opinion matters, and here it simply doesn't.
I hear you. And therefore I think rabbis need to be really good listeners, and the good rabbis are good listeners. And maybe I'll just make one final comment on this particular point. I was talking to somebody about the interesting halachot and tshuvot which have been given in our current war. The question about whether soldiers can come back and drive back from the battlefront if they get 24 hours off the army. Or, for example, questions to do with various different leniencies in Hilchot Nidah, when a soldier is coming home just for a short amount of time, and will a couple be able to be intimate? And there's been some very interesting halachic movement, let's call it that way, during this current war. And we were talking about why that happens. And people spoke about a few different factors. One being that, number one, there are far more religious soldiers. There are tons of religious soldiers, and they're asking questions. There's now WhatsApp, and everybody's connected to their rabbis through WhatsApp. So there's more access. There's more, there's more religious soldiers, and the rabbis they're asking have also been in the army, so they fully understand their situation and can be able to evaluate. And maybe even a fourth factor is the importance of psychological factors and the understanding of how much psychology, mentality plays within the halachic equation. And all of that has led to some remarkable kulot, right? This already started maybe with coronavirus, where certain things shifted there. and here's another wave of turbulence in this current war. And I think that underscores exactly what you're saying. It's not enough just to be a book expert. One has to be, in order, halacha is an intersection between life and between the written word. And it needs a very, very sensitive proficiency, but a proficiency which takes into account the entire human experience and understanding society in order to come out with the right solution.
I'll mention something else, which I think is related to that same idea when you talk about the leniencies that have developed as a result of traumas that have taken place within the Jewish people and throughout the world. Something else which I sometimes think about, and I'm curious, Alex, what you think about this too, is the question of the equating of halacha with the divine will. Now, let me clarify. I believe the halacha is the divine will. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm a Torah Jew. I hope. I try to be. And I certainly believe that halacha represents God's will. The question I sometimes have, and this is a debate I've had with people, is it the sum total of the divine will, or is it a subset of the divine will, such that everything in halacha may be the divine will? That does not mean that something that's not in halacha is by definition not the divine will. Let me give an example. You said that there are certain leniencies that may take place. For example, a couple that is in nidah, but he's coming home for a couple hours from the front, and perhaps we can find leniencies to allow them to touch in certain situations. Okay, that is one way of looking at it. Now I'm going to give a different way of looking at it, which I have mentioned to other people, not necessarily about that. Let's say, for example, someone asks me a certain halacha on a certain case, and I don't know any leniency. I will say, because I also host Intimate Judaism, a podcast about intimacy, these are certain questions that sometimes people address to me, and perhaps I'm not proficient in them, and sometimes I am. I'll say, this is what the halacha is. I don't think there's a leniency. And then the thing which is implicit or sometimes explicit is, when you go behind that bedroom door, when you close it, it really is between the two spouses and God. And no rabbi is allowed to go past that door, meaning I can tell you what halacha says. What you choose to do with that is not for me to say. I think people should keep halacha. I really do. How God judges you after that, it's really not my place to say, to be judgmental and to say, well, if you do violate halacha, and I'm not asking, but if you do violate halacha, maybe in certain situations, God is okay with that. And for anyone to say, by definition, he's not okay with it, meaning halacha is always the divine will, and that's transitive. It goes in both directions. Sometimes that's also limiting of human agency. What do you think about that?
First of all, I'm a big believer in being non-judgmental. I think sometimes there's too much judgment in the Jewish world. I have to worry about my own relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, and I don't need to judge other people and check their tzitzit. And that's certainly... And sometimes you see people who, on the one hand, and we have certainly seen since the 7th of October, people who would not be traditionally considered to be religious, who are phenomenal tzaddikim, whether it's their courage, whether it's their sense of peoplehood, whether it's their sense of participation. So I identify with the idea of being non-judgmental. What I'd like to share with you is a lens which I think will eventually, we're going to go on a long journey here.
Good.
But it's a lens which I think is going to answer your question in a different way. There is a fabulous article by Rav Kook called Chacham Adif Minavi. And I want to share some of the ideas here. I'll try and do it relatively succinctly. Rav Kook actually begins, and he's talking about prophets versus halacha. And he says that he starts off talking about something totally different. He says, let's talk about poets and artists as opposed to practitioners. He says, within society, we have authors, we have poets, we have artists. They frequently take up causes. And he says they do one of two things. They show beauty or they show horrors. You can walk through the daffodils along with William Wordsworth and see the beauty of nature. What do half of the songs in the charts talk about? Love, right? So that's beauty. But also, always artists, music artists, and people in the artistic community are at the forefront of causes where they're fighting against oppression and whatever it might be. So Charles Dickens writes about the sweatshops in Victorian England, and Mark Twain is talking about, slavery in America and whatever it might be. So what do prophets do? They raise an image of beauty, and they also expose horrors and try and fight against them. But are they going to be successful in changing the world? Well, sometimes their ideas can change things, but sometimes they can't. So let's, for example, we remember, you are about the same age as me. So we remember Bob Geldof and Live Aid and Band Aid. right? And he was trying to save starvation in Africa. Now, I don't know, he made a lot of noise. He raised a lot of money. Did it get to Africa? Bono makes concerts about, or he takes up the cause of global warming. Now, in order to change things with global warming, somebody has to actually invent the electric car. Somebody has to decide on carbon emissions. Somebody has to decide about pollution levels. Rav Kook says that in order to change something, you also need not only people of ideas, you need practitioners, you need economists, and people who are going to set policy, and politicians, and people in the legal sphere to create penalties and whatever it might be. If you want to solve starvation in Africa, you have to create a system of clinics and whatever it might be, in a supply line and education. It's much more complicated. So there are ideas, but how do you get ideas into the world? Says Rav Kook, this is the idea of Chacham Adif Minavi. He says something really remarkable. He says, essentially, the prophets are like the artists. They think about big ideas. They talk about Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavot. They know that God is amazing, God is holy. They also talk against all sorts of depravities, social injustice. They talk about idolatry. He says, however, the prophets ultimately were unsuccessful. How do we know? Because the prophets always say, if you carry on like this, you're going to lose your country and you're going to go into Galut and the temple's going to be destroyed. And what do you know? It did. They did. So somehow prophecy, even though now we read it and it's great, wasn't so successful in real time. But he said, what gave Judaism teeth? It was the rabbis who said, not halichot olam lo, ela halachot. Not, I'll tell you the path to God, the spiritual path, but I'm going to translate into halacha. First temple, for example, prayers. The Rambam says there weren't any formal prayers in the first temple. Maybe you prayed when you went to the temple, or maybe there was some tehillim. But suddenly, in the second temple, we start developing the idea of daily prayer. In other areas as well, the rabbis say that there were no brachot in the first temple, apart from maybe Birchat Hamazon, whatever formula it had. And suddenly we start creating a whole liturgy. Once we can pray together, we now can have a synagogue, we can have a shul, and we know how powerful that is as a hub for the community. In first temple, say that there was no muktzah, there was no kiddush, there was no havdalah. You came home from work, I don't know, you had dinner, you went to sleep. What was there to do? Kiddush is amazing. Like, it's the opening ceremony, havdalah is the closing ceremony, like the Olympics, except they light the torch at the end. The rabbis were very clever in being able to, of course, there were Tariag mitzvot, but they managed to create very detail-oriented Judaism. And we all know, as we go through halacha and we see how halacha has its way of expanding to more and more. And says Rav Kook, that ability to get into people's lives, to be such in the nitty-gritty, that was very powerful, because God is in the details in this regard. Halacha really found a way. The rabbis, with their pedantic attention to detail, managed to help people in order to make Judaism more robust. And in this regard, the rabbis had some inkling that they'd gone into Galut once. The way Rav Kook puts it is, the idea of God started translating into the religious idea. And we started creating religious structures, and those structures would somehow take us through. And that's what allowed Judaism to have its own portable homeland, whether we were in Bavel or Morocco, whether we were in France or Buenos Aires, whether we're in, Austin, Texas, or Australia. Wherever we are, we have our shuls, and we have our halacha, and we have our Shulchan Aruch. And he says, ultimately, that prophecy was great. It's got the big ideas, but the litmus test is that actually Judaism was able to survive through these details. I don't know whether I should pause here, because there's a second bit to it as well.
I want to hear the second bit in a moment. I want to first ask a question, though, and perhaps you'll say that's going to take us too far afield, that we should come back to it, because I still want to hear the answer to my question from before. Nevertheless, some might argue, in line with Rav Kook, that was really phenomenal for the past 2,000 years when we were scattered across the face of the earth. Now that, Bezrat Hashem, we continue to come home to the land of Israel, and being scattered in the diaspora is hopefully coming to an end, perhaps it's not as necessary. Perhaps now we need the reverse direction, away from that structure and more towards an unstructured type of spirituality, perhaps in addition to what we have in the structured realm.
Right. So that was a very nice, that's a nice segue to the second bit.
Oh, good.
If I said that halacha is the solution in the first part, Rav Kook then says halacha also creates problems. Now he says it creates problems for several reasons. You've mentioned the notion of coming back to Medina Israel, which I think where sometimes we see things in broad processes, broad societal processes. Right? Maybe I'll answer your question, and I'll answer it and then I'll come back to Rav Kook. Maybe there really is a difference between prophetic Judaism and halachic Judaism. The halachic Judaism has narrow definitions. I'll give you a couple of examples. We're told, lo tonu et hager, don't oppress the ger, don't oppress. Now, who is a ger? There are three possible definitions of ger. Does a ger mean a ger tzedek, somebody who's converted? Does a ger mean a ger toshav, somebody who's not Jewish but lives in our land? Or does it just mean somebody who's a non-citizen? Now, what you might argue is, well, we know that the way halacha paskins, that when it says lo tonu et hager, it means a ger tzedek. Don't be mean, don't oppress somebody who is a convert. Now, by the way, the Orthodox community has what to do in order to improve in that regard as well. But one might argue that from the prophetic perspective, that when you talk about hager, hayatom, va'almana, it's actually not necessarily talking about people who have their full credentials as a Jew. It's actually talking about people who were of other ethnicities, right? Who were maybe ger toshav. We find in King David's army, Ittai Hagiti and Uriah Hachiti. Clearly, these people were fighting in our army, even though they didn't have necessarily halachic status. How do we relate to them, right? Prophetic Judaism might say, listen, you've got a foreigner in your society. He's living your lifestyle. Treat him well. Halachic Judaism might have a more narrower example of that. That might carry over to questions of, like we have a big debate today about giur, conversion. Who should we convert? Should we convert some? Now, when we were living in Galut, and you're 100% correct to mention Galut, you needed to make sure somebody was committed both to Jewish peoplehood and to Jewish halacha, because otherwise they weren't part of the people. But now, when we have immigrants to Israel who, for whatever reason, are not halachically Jewish, but they speak Ivrit, they fight in Sahal, they're willing to live and die, mamish ameich ami, right? They're even willing to say Elohai Elohai, right? They're willing to say, the Shabbos that I don't keep is the Shabbos of the Jewish people. But they won't keep Shabbos. They're willing to sing Shema Yisrael as they're about to go into battle. But they're not willing to be worried about, necessarily keeping every detail of the halacha. Are we going to say that there is a different definition of conversion? This is an area where you might even argue that halachic Judaism and prophetic Judaism go in different directions. And what you're asking is a fascinating question about whether, the Torah of the prophets and the Torah of the rabbis sometimes diverges. And then we have to ask ourselves the question of what seems, can the Torah of the prophets somehow insert itself as a halachic criterion as we've sort of shifted back to peoplehood?
Because what you're saying right now really reminds me of that bigger question of halachic values versus halachic practice. And very often they go together. At times we might argue that they move apart. A simple example might be Rabbi Zatzal and his opinions about slavery, when he says that the Torah is anti-slavery, even as he acknowledges that the Torah says you have to keep your slaves. You're not even allowed to free slaves in certain circumstances. So how can the Torah be anti-slavery? He says that's a halachic value. And he has a very specific way of understanding the history of slavery, why what was necessary then was designed to be eliminated eventually. But that's an example where obviously not on a practical level today, but the technical halachic practice is very different from at least what he sees as the specific halachic value embedded within or maybe against that practice.
Right. And Rav Rabinovich's, probably most famous student, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zatzal, was very famous as having sort of tried to bridge this by saying that Hashem, in his great wisdom, seeded those ideas about the notion of freedom in the Torah, so that over a course of thousands of years of civilization, eventually the sensitive, ethical world would reach beyond slavery. What's fascinating, if I come back to Rav Kook, is that Rav Kook, what for him it wasn't Medinat Israel because he never lived to see Medinat Israel, but for him I think what was affecting him very strongly was the emancipation, and he saw in the emancipation Jews who were very passionate in so many ways, but had fallen out of halachic Judaism, and in fact the early Zionists who were so devoted to the Jewish peoplehood and to the Jewish future. But actually, they did this by rejecting their Judaism. Right? One of the amazing poems I remember reading by Avram Shlonsky. Avram Shlonsky is one of those poems from the 1940s. I actually read, interestingly enough, that as a child he was the neighbor of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and they were in and out of each other's houses. But he writes a poem in the 1940s talking about the roads, the newly paved roads, and the kibbutzim. And he compares this to the land wearing tefillin. He says, I don't need to wear tefillin. The land's got its own batim, and the roads are the retzuot. And, I've replaced my Judaism for a national Judaism, right? Rav Kook experienced, he saw those chalutzim. He lived in Eastern Europe in the time, and he was experiencing the emancipation. And he said, here's the problem. Halacha has got so thick, that solution, which Judaism almost fell apart between First Temple and Second Temple. People were assimilating. It was very difficult to keep Judaism. The response was halacha. The response was a detailed-oriented Judaism. He says, now this has run its course for 2,000 years, 2,500 years, and now we can't see the wood from the trees. We can't see those values. You ask people, and this is where we come full circle in our conversation, people will say, yes, I do keep all the laws of davening, but does it make a difference if I say Mashi Paroch Amor Hashem or not? Or I say that extra parak of Tehillim, right, or not? I don't know if it does. I would like to have spirituality. They look at society and say, I know there are lots of halachot, but I want to have social justice. And these chalutzim who were socialists, Rav Kook says, we need nevuah to come back. We need the return of prophecy. He identifies, if you want, halacha as detail-oriented Judaism and nevuah as big picture Judaism, value Judaism. He says we need the big values to come back, which is why Rav Kook was really into the idea of learning not just the halachic sections of the Talmud, but also the Aggadic sections, not just learning the Talmud, but also learning Tanach, philosophy. And he felt that this would enable us to create a balanced Judaism where we would start being able to connect the small details into the big picture, into the big values.
It's interesting. Yesterday I was learning with my son Yaki, who went back to the army after having a break for Purim in a few days. He's now back in training again. And last night we were learning some Derech Hashem. And in the process of learning with him, I quoted Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, something which he says at the very beginning of Man is Not Alone. He describes the difference, and he wasn't talking about halacha per se, but I think it relates to this. He describes the difference between time and calendar, or melody and a violin, or interestingly, the afterlife and life in Olam Hazeh in this world. And I wonder if what you're saying also could be another example of that. Spirituality, prophetic Judaism, and the details of halacha. I wonder if it would fit into that same rubric as well.
Well, I to be honest, I really think that's a really interesting lens that you're giving. But I actually think this is our challenge, right? To make this more present. And first of all, I think I find some amazing teachers in today's world who are actually working on this. If you read, for example, Rav Yehuda Brandis's books on Talmudic sugyot, he's sort of taken halachic sugyot, but really tried to mine the values which are behind them, and and he's just one example. There are plenty of teachers who are doing this. Rav Dov Berkovitz, definitely has done this, to be able to see the values which are underpinning the halachic discussion, not necessarily to get involved in the question of, this is the kushia of the Tosfos, and this is how the Pnei Yoshua is going to answer it, but to really try and see the Brisker method does this to a certain degree, but the Brisker method, takes it a bit in a more sort of abstract way, as Rav Soloveitchik said, almost like a mathematician, but to bring this into, life's issues and to really bring it out. And I think that's so critical to learn that way. I think the return both to society and the return to Tanach is not an incident. That it's not incidental that somehow we've come back to the land of Israel, but we've also had a desire to come back to Tanach. with all the broad issues, that Tanach throws our way about society, leadership, government, corruption, war, and all of those questions that we're grappling with every single day here are played out in the Tanakh. I'm not saying they're not played out in the Talmud, but when you take them as a narrow legal issue in the Talmud, they don't always sort of come into full technicolor.
Well, in that case, given that we already said Lo b'shamayim hi, this is not something which is in heaven, let's bring it down to the earth. Let's talk about practice. How would you say that a prophetic Judaism, the kind advocated by Rav Kook, who obviously is not arguing for the abrogation of halacha, it has to work together, what would that look like in practice? How would we be able to combine that big picture Judaism, the melody, with the violin of practical halacha, which we don't want to, of course, discard either?
Well, I mean, I certainly would like to look here. I might be, getting political. And I know there are people, but for example, the very question about how people can be living in this country and not taking part in our national defense, to me, is something which I find, I think you can defend it on halachic ground, but to me, it's just the whole question about whether you see your Judaism as sort of a very narrow technical discipline, which sometimes you're happy to find a loophole to avoid, or whether you sort of like take those values and try and live them to the most. So if we've got values of ben adam l'chavero, and we've got values of caring for others, how can it be that you have a religious Knesset member who would talk disparagingly about another person, in a sort of like disgusting adversarial way? That would seem to me that is not a Jewish idea. The idea that we would like to see Israel should be the place which has the lowest incident of driving accidents, because if we would take our Jewish values and we'd really take pikuach nefesh seriously, we would all drive far more safely, despite the stresses that we have in our lives. I do think there are many things which are built into the Israeli system, like bituach leumi, which, to my mind, the prophets would look at and say, Baruch Hashem, this is a Jewish country, whereas there are certain countries in the world which don't have a social net. The idea that people who are under unfortunate circumstances in Israel get so much from the country, from social services, to the fact that we all have free medical care and we can get access, without worrying about our means, to 21st century medical care, to my mind, the prophets would be smiling at that and saying, this is just wonderful. But the question is whether we're willing to see our Judaism not just in the Bet Midrash and not just in, the things that I say, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Asher Kedishanu Tzvotanu, before we do them, but rather, on my broad interactions with other people. I also think, when we talk about Dan lekaf zechut, right? And we spoke earlier in this conversation about whether we are judging other people or looking disparagingly about other people. To my mind, those are primary Jewish ethics. When Sefer Zechariah, the people come to Zechariah and they say to him, look, the temple's built. Do we still need to fast? And Zechariah is like, okay, well, I'll give you the answer. God says, actually, when you were fasting, he wasn't fasting. Because what he really cares about is whether you think badly about one another and whether you are truthful and whether you have justice in your society. So just, do you understand? That's what I really care about, says God. That's living prophetic Judaism, I would hope, Some people consider that to be a sort of a liberal agenda, but to my mind, it's the prophetic agenda. It's God's agenda.
It sounds beautiful to me. And I certainly agree with you about numerous issues that you mentioned, including driving safety. It has bothered me for a very long time, this idea that Israel is not that good when it comes to saving lives on the road. I don't know what it requires. Does it require better infrastructure? Does it require more police on the roads? Does it require a cultural change? Whatever it is, to me, the religious political parties, which personally, as I've mentioned many times, I don't think should exist. That's a different conversation. But if there are religious political parties, why are those religious political parties not putting driving safety, which is pikuach nefesh, saving lives, at the top of the religious agenda? Israel should be, as a Jewish state which cares about life, v'chai bahem, people live by the Torah, we should be at the very top of the world's charts in terms of fewest driving deaths, fewest accidents, the best infrastructure, the best safety measures on the roads. I don't know what that would require, but the fact that no one seems to care about it from a religious perspective, and I'm speaking about the politicians, the religious political parties, to me, that's an indictment of those very parties.
In one of Rav Lichtenstein's articles, I forget now which one it is, he tells the story about how one day he was walking through the streets of Jerusalem and he saw some, it happens to be Haredi kids, there was a man who was struggling with I think his car, and they were discussing between themselves whether they can help him because he's not religious. And there's a question in the Gemara whether you're allowed to help a Rasha. And Rav Lichtenstein said, like, what is this discussion, right? He says, I know that people from my modern Orthodox community, those children would have rushed to help this person who was struggling with his car. But then he says, but why do we have to choose? Why do we have to choose between knowing our tradition, between knowing the Gemara? Why do the people who know the Gemara not help? And why do the people who are going to help not know the Gemara?
Right.
And really, we need to have both. And we really need to try. And by the way, I'm in the religious Zionist camp, and I think there's a lot right. There's some things wrong in our community, but broadly, I think there is a wonderful intersection of values and action in our community in certain ways, and it's something that we need to try and work harder to expand. But maybe we need to talk about it more, and maybe we need to really express this idea that we need to see Judaism and the values which underpin Judaism. If I mentioned Rabbi Sachs before, he was very, very good in bringing out those values. He was somebody who didn't get caught in the minutiae of halacha, and he spoke in a language which people, I think, what people are always why they're so inspired by what he did was because he actually managed to mine those values and to full-throatedly talk about them.
So let me ask about the reverse side, because we're speaking now about people who are committed to halacha and being able to include in their halachic practice, or perhaps transcend their halachic practice by also including these values as a big part, a key part of their religious life. What about people on the other side? What about people who say, I only want to look at the big picture Judaism. I'm not interested, or I'm turned off by the minutiae of halacha, of all those details which seem completely irrelevant to my life. I think that most Torah Jews would say, and I'm sure Rav Kook would say the same, that while it's important to have these values, that doesn't mean we can ignore the halachic process altogether.
Yeah. So, this is obviously something which people will frequently say. I think in any area in which we care, the details matter. Whether it's, in the way we interact in our marriages, whether it's, people, whether it's our cuisine. Some people, take whatever thing you're passionate about, right? It's certainly true about our kids in the army, making sure that every sort of detail, it starts off even with every single detail of the uniform and whether they're given, however long they're given for their 30 seconds to be here and 2 minutes to do that. If you want something to work efficiently, it's true in our workplaces where we have certain protocols and there's a right way to do something, there's a wrong way to do something. It's true about our hobbies, right? We take areas, if somebody's into, they're into cycling, they're a marathon runner, they'll worry about changing their shoes with a certain regularity. They'll know about the aerodynamics of their bicycle and whether they've, greased the chain of their bike. So there is no area which matters to any person in which you don't take account of the details. And even when it comes to values, right? When it comes to social services, or as I say, when it comes to the way I interact with my children, so many modern people go to their houses. You'll see 4 books on the shelf, right? About how to talk to your kids, so your kids will listen or whatever it might be. You'll find books on people's shelves about the 5 love languages and about, relationships, because when something's important to us, we need to find techniques, and we need to find protocols to make it happen. And I think that's really, if I come back to what Rav Kook says about halacha, is that halacha wasn't a replacement for Jewish values. It was an embodiment of Jewish values. The idea that, so you can say, what difference if I wear Shabbos clothes or if I don't wear Shabbos clothes? So you can take away any one ingredient, but we understand that Shabbat is created by the preparation and by things in advance and the cooking in advance, as well as, by the way, the Shabbos traditions, whether it's your Jachnun or whether it's your Chulent, right? Whatever tradition you come from. and the Shabbat clothes, and the Zmirot at the table, and the tunes, and all of that, becomes that heady mix. And in that sense, God is really in the details. So whenever we want to create an atmosphere, whenever we want to create a reality, we do that by paying attention to the details.
Let me go back to the story you mentioned a moment ago about Rav Aaron Lichtenstein's exile and that man who was being ignored, or there was a debate among the kids in that neighborhood of whether to help that person or not. And as you, I think, correctly said, the people who learn Torah might have that debate, and the people who would immediately rush to him don't necessarily learn Torah, and that's part of the problem. The issue is, Alex, though, that on some level, those kids were right. The halacha says you don't help a rasha, and if you follow the halacha further, what is the definition of a rasha? It may very well be someone who is not shomer Shabbat. So on a halachic level, purely, they have an argument that maybe they're right, even though we find that morally offensive. On the other hand, the fact that the halacha might demand something which we find morally offensive is itself something which we need to contend with. So obviously we can find ways of bridging it. We can say, well, he's a tinok shenishba, he's not responsible for his actions because of that, and therefore he's not technically a rasha. But that's really sort of ignoring and getting out of the problem. What do we do when the values go head-to-head against the halacha?
It's a great question. Let me just, by the way, mention first of all, we can never judge a book by its cover. I once sat on an airplane next to a Haredi man on the surface of it, a chassid. In fact, I was a bit irritated because I was sitting next to a woman and he wouldn't sit next to a woman, so he ended up sitting next to me. And I don't like that practice, and I was a bit irritated. It was one of the most fascinating flights I ever had. We sat speaking for hours and hours and hours. And he was actually one of the most open-minded people I ever came across. And he told me an amazing story. He said when he was a child, he literally grew up in Mea She'arim. And he said that when he was 7 or 8, his mother once took him to the doctor. And he was talking to his mother in Yiddish. And he said something about calling him the Shegetz, the goy, right? And the man who was the doctor, who was Jewish, but he didn't have a kippah on. And of course, this was a child who grew up in Mea She'arim, and he had obviously been taught to divide his world into Mea She'arim type people, and everybody else wasn't Jewish. He said to him, how dare you call me a shegetz, right? How dare you call me somebody who's not Jewish? I put on tefillin every single day. I might not wear a kippah, but you don't know what I do. And this man, who I was sitting on the plane with, he must be a 50-year-old man, said, and ever since then, I have decided never to judge anyone by what they look at, right? To learn something as a 7 or 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, and then so first of all, I will say that again, come back. You never know, right? There might be somebody with a kippah looking very religious who does all sorts of things wrong, and there are many, many people who don't have their hair covered, head covered, and who knows the cheshbonot of the Ribbono Shel Olam. I certainly, every single person who serves in the army, as far as I'm concerned, is a tzaddik gamur. I would also, issue a call to one of the beautiful things about halacha, as we all know, is that halacha is complex. And I don't believe that it's simple, that halacha says you shouldn't help it. There's one line in the Gemara which says you don't help a rasha. So as you said, maybe we can define him not as a rasha. Maybe we can actually define him as a tzaddik. Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisraelhu, right? And there are many, many other criteria. And again, I think it is incumbent upon us to develop a halacha that it is. I think it's exactly what Rav Kook wanted when he said we have to reunite the nevuah with halacha, that we have to redefine, halacha in such ways that it achieves the values that will take our country and our nation forward. And I know there are arguments about that, so let those be the arguments, but let's talk to each other with respect, and let's try and carve out a halacha which enables us to be the best we can be as a nation.
I have one last question for you, Alex, if it's okay, because we've spoken a lot about halacha versus values, and we're using values almost as synonymous with that idea of prophetic Judaism. But there's also an idea of spirituality, which is this nebulous term, which might be associated nowadays with neo-Hasidut or various other movements that emphasize the spiritual. So is there an element of that we can talk about just for a few moments, the idea of making sure that we imbue our halachic practice with extra spirituality? Because even though the primary thing in Judaism has to be the action, it has to be those values, being moral, living a godly life, people still crave that experiential dimension. People crave the idea of being able to feel God's presence in a way that they often find in halacha. It doesn't do it for them in that way. So how can we use that prophetic idea to imbue halacha with a sense of the presence of the Shekhinah, the divine presence?
Yeah, so I'm sure there are lots of avenues, and I do have a soft spot for all Chassidut, and I have found myself in recent years being attracted to it. But I actually like to go back to the other dimension, and I like to relate to two things. First is a sense of God awareness, and the second is a learning. Maybe I'll start with the learning. When Rav Lichtenstein was asked about women studying Talmud, and whether women should study Talmud, some people see it as a feminist thing. And he said he wasn't worried about the question about whether women were obligated in Talmud Torah or were allowed to Talmud Torah. He said the following. He said, when you experience the shofar, it's one thing to listen to the shofar, but if you've learned through Masechet Rosh Hashanah, listening to the shofar is a completely different experience, because you've got all those layers of association and you've got all those multiple layers of meaning. It becomes so much richer. So I think, one of the problems when people say I'm disconnected, I feel like this is spiritually dry, maybe part of the problem is a lack of education. And we've been unsuccessful in being able, really, we talk about tefillah and we send kids from a very young age to daven every single morning. But how often do we teach about tefillot? How often do we actually teach people, first of all, how to pray? Rav Dov Zinger has written a wonderful book about how to pray, and also what the tefillot are about. So what I would argue is that if we were enabled ourselves to take areas in which we experience and to give them far more deeper levels of meaning, I think these things will burst from being something monochrome into something really very technicolor. So I think one element here is that appropriate education and a depth of understanding, I think, can really bring all sorts of Jewish experiences into a different frame. And maybe part of the responsibility of the teacher is to talk about the experiential and not only the detached technicalities of the given practice. So that's one area. The second area that I'd like to say is just simply the God awareness. Rav Lichtenstein, I'm going to mention him again, I did learn with him for many years, has an article in the book By His Light about being commanded. He says there's the notion of a mitzvah. Sometimes we use the word mitzvah as go and see your bubby. It's a mitzvah. It's a good thing. But he said, but a mitzvah is really a command. It's like the commanding officer gives you a command, and you salute and you say, yes, sir. Now, he said, well, what is the notion of a mitzvah? Is it just a dry command? And you can look at it as something completely different. You know that Michelangelo piece from the Sistine Chapel where you have like God and man and the two fingers touch. And the question is, when am I touching God? When do I know that I'm really touching God or God's really touching me? Is it when I sing a niggun? Now I could argue that all music gives us a sense of the sublime. Maybe I'm just imagining it. So Rav Lichtenstein said, when you're touching God? When he commands you and you listen. When he commands you and you listen, you are touching God because you're in contact. Now, do we have that awareness? Do I just say, well, I'm doing that mitzvah because God told me, or do I have a sense that I am somehow in a relationship at this given moment? And I would argue that one practice which enables us to do that is brachot. Brachot enables us to feel a sense of the godly around ourselves. I would also argue that for me, limud Tanach definitely enables me to feel the presence of God in all sorts of different moments, whether I'm walking the streets of Israel and I go past this place and I can feel the resonances of the spiritual in the places that I am, or in certain practices where I'm experiencing a moral dilemma, and I recall a parak in Tanach or maybe an Agadah where that moral dilemma was brought. So I think it's incumbent upon ourselves to realize that we are in this sort of web of experiences with Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and that when we do engage in a mitzvah, it's a very palpable moment of contact. And I think we have to, if we want to enhance that spirituality, it really is there, but it's really a question of a consciousness. And consciousness, again, it doesn't come automatically. I think as teachers, we need to be able to teach it more. We need to be able to engage with it more and communicate those sorts of mindsets to our students, to our children, and then maybe it'll become more present for us. It's not to exclude music. It's not to exclude, all sorts of teachings, but yeah.
That image of touching God, using the Sistine Chapel ceiling as an example, sort of a mashal for that idea through mitzvot. I think that's just such a beautiful image, which I never thought about in that way before. So thank you for that. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of Rav Soloveitchik in Ish Halacha, Halachic Man. There's a strange passage there when he talks about, I believe it was his father or his grandfather, I think it was his father, who was the Makri, who was calling out the sounds of the shofar, and the Baal Tokea, who was a Chabad Chassid, started crying. And his father said to him, "Why are you crying? Did you cry when you take the lulav?" And it's sort of a strange moment. It's strange because intuitively, I think most people would assume that blowing the shofar is a more dramatic moment of encounter with the divine. We're in the divine courtroom on Rosh Hashanah, whereas picking up the lulav while a mitzvah doesn't have that same feeling of pressure, that same feeling of being on edge. Nevertheless, Rav Soloveitchik explains it the way that he does. And from what you just said, using that mashal, that metaphor of the finger of God touching Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, we can also understand what Rav Soloveitchik meant by this. Either way, you're touching God. The presence of God should be palpable not only in the great dramatic moment of the shofar, but when you pick up a lulav and etrog too. When you do any mitzvah, we should be able to have that same experience of the presence of God, of touching God. So I appreciate that image very much. Rabbi Israel, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I am honored to speak with you, and I've learned a lot today, and I appreciate your baring your heart and talking about these important issues. I'm sure we all learned a lot, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. And Bezrat Hashem will have other opportunities to discuss and talk in Torah and spirituality.
Subscribe to The Orthodox Conundrum on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of The Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review The Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.